Rome, March 15th, 44 BC. The most powerful man in the world walks confidently toward the Senate. Hundreds of citizens cheer his arrival. Senators bow respectfully. Within minutes, more than 60 of those same senators surround him. Knives flash from beneath white togas. 23 stab wounds follow. Among the attackers stands one of Caesar's closest friends, Marcus Brutus. The assassination lasts less than 5 minutes. Yet those 5 minutes destroy a republic that had ruled the Mediterranean for centuries. But why would Rome murder the Augustus? Arrival. Senators bow respectfully. Within minutes, more than 60 of those same senators surround him. Knives flash from beneath white togas. 23 stab wounds follow. Among the attackers stands one of Caesar's closest friends, Marcus Brutus. The assassination lasts less than 5 minutes. Yet those 5 minutes destroy a republic that had ruled the Mediterranean for centuries. But why would Rome murder the man who made it powerful? And did the conspirators save the republic or create something far worse? To understand how this happened, we have to go back decades before the knives were ever drawn, to a Rome that was already tearing itself apart long before Julius Caesar ever entered the Senate. The Roman Republic that Caesar was born into in the year 100 BC was not the stable, orderly state that people often imagine. For nearly 500 years, Rome had been governed without a king, ruled instead by a senate of aristocrats and elected magistrates, and in the year 100 BC was not the stable, orderly state that people often imagine. For nearly 500 years, Rome had been governed without a king, ruled instead by a senate of aristocrats and elected magistrates, a system designed to prevent any single man from holding too much power. In practice, by the time Caesar was a boy, that system was rotting. Wealth had concentrated in the hands of a small number of noble families. Ordinary farmers, ruined by decades of warfare, had lost their land to enormous slave-run estates. Rome's streets filled with the poor and unemployed, desperate men with nothing to lose. Political offices, once earned through service, were increasingly bought through bribery. And most dangerously, Roman generals had begun to realize what the Republic's founders had feared most, that a general's soldiers were loyal not to Rome, but to whichever commander paid and rewarded them. Men like Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla had already shown in bloody civil conflicts before Caesar's rise that an ambitious general with a loyal army could march on Rome and seize control by force. The Republic had survived, but barely, and the precedent had been set. Rome was a powder keg long before Caesar lit the match. Into this unstable world, Julius Caesar was born into the Julii, a patrician family that claimed descent from the goddess Venus herself. It was a proud lineage, but by the time he came of age, more prestigious in name than in influence. His father died suddenly when Caesar was only 16, thrusting him into the role of head of his household. Rome at that time was gripped by civil war between the factions of Marius and Sulla, and Caesar's family connections placed him on the losing side. When Sulla emerged victorious and began purging his enemies, the young Caesar found himself marked for death simply for being related to Marius by marriage. He refused to divorce his wife when ordered, a defiant act that nearly cost him his life, and was forced into hiding until influential relatives convinced Sulla to spare him. Sulla reportedly warned those who pleaded for Caesar's life that in this young man he saw many Mariuses. It was an eerily accurate prediction. Caesar fled Rome and joined the military in the East, beginning a long apprenticeship in war and politics. It was during this period that one of the most famous early stories of Caesar's life took place. While sailing across the Aegean Sea, Caesar was captured by pirates and held for ransom. He treated his captivity almost as an inconvenience, joking with the pirates that the ransom they demanded was too low, and warning them, half in jest, that once freed, he would return and crucify every one of them. The pirates laughed it off. They should not have. The moment his ransom was paid, Caesar raised a small fleet, hunted down the pirates, and executed them exactly as promised. The story reveals something essential about him even in youth: unshakable confidence, sharp strategic thinking, and a willingness to follow through on his word no matter how long it took. Pirates, and executed them exactly as promised. The story reveals something essential about him even in youth: unshakable confidence, sharp strategic thinking, and a willingness to follow through on his word no matter how long it took. Returning to Rome, Caesar began climbing the traditional ladder of political offices known as the cursus honorum, serving as military tribune and then quaestor. He was known for his oratory, his generosity toward the common people, and his willingness to go into significant debt-funding lavish public games that won him popularity, even as it worried the Senate's conservative members. Caesar was, from very early on, a masterful reader of public sentiment, understanding that the loyalty of the common people and the legions mattered far more than the approval of the Senate. By the age of 40, Julius Caesar was no longer simply another Roman politician. He was becoming something Rome had never seen before: That transformation accelerated when Caesar entered an informal political alliance with two of the most powerful men in Rome, an arrangement historians call the First Triumvirate. The first was Pompey the Great, a brilliant general whose eastern victories had made him enormously popular and wealthy. The second was Marcus Licinius Crassus, reputedly the richest man in Rome who had crushed the slave rebellion led by Spartacus. Individually, each had enemies in the Senate blocking their ambitions. Together they combined their wealth, military support, and political influence to dominate Roman politics. With Pompey and Crassus backing him, Caesar secured the consulship, the highest elected office in Rome, and then command of the province of Gaul, a vast and only partially conquered territory that would become the stage for the most legendary military campaign of his life. The Gallic Wars, lasting roughly 8 years, transformed Caesar from a clever politician into a military legend. He led his legions through what is now France, Belgium, and parts of Germany and Britain, fighting dozens of tribes in brutal, often desperate campaigns. He crossed the Rhine into Germanic territory as a show of Roman power, something no Roman commander had done before, and led 2 expeditions across the Channel into Britain, a land so distant and mysterious to Romans that simply setting foot there became legendary. His greatest triumph came at the siege of Alesia, where he defeated a massive coalition of Gallic tribes led by the chieftain Vercingetorix, completing the conquest of Gaul. Caesar wrote detailed accounts of these campaigns himself, sending them back to Rome as political propaganda that ensured the public saw him as an unmatched general. His soldiers, meanwhile, developed fierce personal loyalty to him. He shared their hardships, rewarded their bravery, and remembered individual soldiers by name. To his legions, he was practically invincible and utterly devoted to their well-being. That loyalty would prove decisive in the years ahead. While Caesar was winning glory in Gaul, the alliance that enabled his rise was collapsing. Crassus was killed in a disastrous campaign against the Parthian Empire, removing one leg of the triumvirate. Pompey, increasingly uneasy about Caesar's growing power, drifted back toward the conservative faction in the Senate, the very men who had always distrusted Caesar. Tensions escalated until the Senate demanded Caesar give up his command and return to Rome as a private citizen, stripped of legal protection. Caesar understood what this meant. Without his legions, his enemies would prosecute him, strip his wealth and status, and likely end his life. He faced an impossible choice: surrender everything or defy the Senate outright. In January of 49 BC, Caesar made his decision. He led a single legion across the Rubicon River, the small stream marking the legal boundary between his province and Italy. Roman law forbade any general from bringing an army into Italy under arms. By crossing it, Caesar committed an act of open rebellion. According to tradition, he declared at the river's edge that the die was now cast, and there was no turning back. The phrase crossing the Rubicon remains, more than 2,000 years later, a universal expression for passing the point of no return. The civil war that followed was swift and devastating. Pompey, caught off guard, fled Italy along with much of the Senate. Caesar pursued him across the Mediterranean, defeating his forces decisively at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece. Pompey fled to Egypt, only to be betrayed and assassinated by agents of the Egyptian court, hoping to win favor with Caesar. When Caesar was later presented with Pompey's severed head, accounts describe him as genuinely grieved rather than pleased. He spent time in Egypt afterward, becoming entangled in its civil war and beginning his famous relationship with Queen Cleopatra before returning to consolidate control over the Roman world, defeating the remaining pockets of resistance in North Africa and Spain. By 45 BC, Julius Caesar stood utterly unopposed, returning to Rome not as one general among many, but as master of the entire Roman world. The Senate, whether out of genuine admiration, fear, or political survival, began heaping honors on him at an alarming pace. He was named dictator, an office meant under Roman tradition to be temporary, limited to 6 months in times of crisis. His dictatorship was extended again, and again until in early 44 BC, the Senate granted him the title Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. Statues of Caesar were erected beside those of Rome's ancient kings. His face appeared on coins, an honor previously reserved for the deceased. A month of the calendar, July, was renamed in his honor, a name that survives today. Ordinary Romans adored him. He had ended the chaos of civil war, distributed land to veterans and the poor, and reformed the calendar into a system remarkably close to the one still used today. To the average citizen, Caesar was not a tyrant, he was a savior. But inside the Senate, among the aristocratic families who had governed Rome for honor, watching the title dictator for life attached permanently to his name, a growing by the one thing Rome had sworn 500 years earlier that it would never allow again: a king. The Senate begins plotting. The men who began meeting in secret throughout early 44 BC were not, for the most part, personal enemies of Caesar. Many were former allies, men Caesar had personally pardoned after the civil war, and whose careers he had advanced. This is precisely what made the conspiracy so devastating. At its center stood Marcus Junius Brutus, a man whose family history was steeped in the mythology of Roman liberty. His ancestors credited with driving out Rome's last king and founding the Republic itself. Brutus had fought against Caesar during the Civil War, siding with Pompey, yet Caesar spared his life and showed him extraordinary personal favor, treating him almost as a son. Persistent rumors even suggested Brutus might have been Caesar's biological son through his long affair with Brutus's mother, Servilia, though this was never confirmed. Brutus was reportedly tormented by the decision, torn between gratitude toward Caesar and his belief that no man should rule Rome as a king. Anonymous notes were left at statues of his ancestor, urging him to live up to his family's legacy and free Rome again. Working alongside Brutus was Gaius Cassius Longinus, a sharp, forceful commander, generally regarded as the true organizer behind the conspiracy. Where Brutus wrestled with hesitation, Cassius was decisive, motivated by genuine political conviction mixed with personal resentment of Caesar's godlike status. Cassius understood the conspiracy needed Brutus specifically, not merely as a participant, but as its symbolic face, since Brutus's family name carried enormous moral weight with the Roman public. Beyond these two figures, the conspiracy grew to include more than 60 senators, an extraordinary number that speaks to how widespread unease about Caesar's power had become. Among the most significant was Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, one of Caesar's most trusted commanders and personal friends, who had served loyally throughout the Gallic Wars and was even named in Caesar's will as a secondary heir. That trust would prove fatal, because it was Decimus who would ultimately ensure Caesar walked into the Senate that day. Also involved was Gaius Trebonius, another loyal former general, and Publius Servilius Casca, credited by ancient sources as the conspirator who struck the first blow. Gaius Ligarius, a senator Caesar had personally pardoned, also joined, reportedly telling Brutus that his health mattered little if it meant striking a blow for Roman liberty. The motives driving these men varied, but several threads run through nearly all of them. First was a genuine ideological fear of monarchy. Roman political identity was built around the trauma of their ancient kings and the pride of having overthrown them, and the idea of any single man ruling permanently struck at the core of what many senators believed Rome was supposed to be. Second was simple loss of personal power, as the Senate, which had governed Rome collectively for centuries, was increasingly reduced to rubber-stamping Caesar's choices. Third was personal jealousy and rivalry, individual grudges built up over years of political maneuvering. Through the early months of 44 BC, the conspirators met secretly in small groups at each other's homes, careful never to gather in numbers large enough to attract suspicion, and remarkably, the secret held. They debated how the assassination should be carried out, considering the Appian Way or the gladiatorial games, before ultimately settling on the Senate itself, reasoning that killing a tyrant inside the very institution he was accused of destroying carried powerful symbolic meaning. The date chosen was the 15th of March, the Ides of March, a day Caesar was scheduled to attend a Senate meeting before departing, days later on a major campaign against the Parthian Empire. That would keep him away from Rome and from the conspirators' reach for years. If Caesar was to be stopped, it had to happen before he left. The conspirators sharpened their daggers. The days leading up to the Ides of March were filled, according to Roman historians writing decades later, with omens and unease. A soothsayer named Sporina had reportedly warned Caesar weeks earlier that great danger awaited him no later than the Ides of March. As Caesar made his way to the Senate on the morning of the 15th, he is said to have passed the soothsayer and joked that the Ides of March had come, to which the soothsayer grimly replied that they had come, but not yet gone. Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, reportedly suffered a terrifying nightmare the night before and begged him not to attend. Caesar, uneasy himself, seriously considered staying home and postponing the session. This is where Decimus Brutus Albinus, the trusted friend and general, played his most treacherous role. Aware that Caesar's absence would collapse the plot, he personally visited Caesar's home that morning, gently mocking the idea of canceling the meeting over a dream and warning that the senators, many waiting to grant him further honors that day, might mock him for hiding at home. Trusting Decimus completely, Caesar relented and set out for the Senate meeting, held that day not in the traditional Senate house, but in a hall attached to the theater of Pompey, ironically named after the rival he had defeated years earlier. Along the way, a man reportedly tried to warn Caesar directly, pressing a scroll into his hand that detailed the entire conspiracy by name. Caesar, surrounded by well-wishers, simply held onto the paper, intending to read it later. He never got the chance. He arrived and took his seat on a golden chair before the assembled senators. As was custom, petitioners gathered around him, among them Lucius Tillius Cimber, a conspirator who approached asking for the recall of his exiled brother. As Caesar waved him off, Cimber grabbed his toga and pulled it down from his shoulders. a prearranged signal that the moment had come. Publius Casca struck first, stabbing at Caesar's neck from behind, though accounts suggest the first blow was clumsy and only wounded him. Caesar reportedly spun around, grabbed Casca's arm, and cried out in shock and pain, stunned that the attack was real. Within seconds, the other conspirators surged forward, daggers drawn from beneath their togas. Caesar attempted to fight back and flee, but he was surrounded on all sides, unable to escape the crush of bodies and blades. Ancient historians describe a chaotic, brutal scene, conspirators accidentally wounding each other in the frenzy as they struggled to land their own blow, each of them determined to share personal responsibility for the act, so that no single man could be blamed or credited alone. Caesar reportedly continued to resist and struggle until he saw Marcus Brutus among his attackers, dagger raised. It is at this moment that later tradition, though not confirmed by the most reliable ancient sources, places Caesar's famous final words, expressing his shock and grief at seeing Brutus, a man he trusted and treated almost as a son, among those who had come to kill him. Upon seeing Brutus, Caesar reportedly stopped resisting entirely, covering his face with his toga and allowing the remaining blows to fall. In total, Caesar suffered 23 stab wounds, though Roman physicians, who later examined his body, determined that only one, a wound to the chest, was actually fatal. He collapsed and died at the base of a statue of Pompey the Great, his former ally and rival, blood pooling across the marble floor of the very hall built by the man he had once defeated in civil war. The killers believe Rome has been saved. They are completely wrong. In the immediate aftermath, the conspirators expected celebration. Instead, they were met with confusion and terror. Senators who had not been part of the plot fled the hall in panic, screaming through the streets that Caesar had been murdered. Word spread with astonishing speed, and the city descended into chaos, shops shuttering as citizens barricaded themselves inside their homes. Far from being hailed as liberators, Brutus, Cassius, and the other conspirators found the streets of Rome largely hostile or indifferent to their cause. Most ordinary Romans, who had adored Caesar for his generosity and his ending of decades of civil war, viewed the killing with horror and suspicion. Mark Antony, Caesar's close ally and co-consul, escaped the hall during the chaos and went into hiding, unsure whether the conspiracy extended beyond Caesar alone. An uneasy truce followed. The conspirators, holed up on the Capitoline Hill, negotiated amnesty in exchange for allowing Caesar's funeral and will to be honored, a decision that proved a catastrophic miscalculation. At the funeral, Mark Antony delivered one of the most consequential speeches in Roman history. Rather than directly condemning the conspirators, he recounted Caesar's generosity and sacrifices, skillfully stirring the crowd through theatrical presentation of Caesar's bloodied toga, then revealed the will, which left money to every Roman citizen, and donated his gardens to the public. The crowd's grief exploded into fury. Rioters cremated Caesar's body on an improvised pyre in the Forum, then turned into a mob hunting the conspirators through Rome's streets, nearly killing several, including, in a tragic case of mistaken identity, a poet named Cinna who shared a name with one of the plotters. Having expected celebration, the conspirators were instead forced to flee Rome for their own safety. Civil war becomes inevitable. What followed was a prolonged and bloody struggle for control of the Roman world. Mark Antony initially positioned himself as Caesar's political heir, but he soon found a formidable and unexpected rival in Caesar's own grandnephew and adopted heir, an 18-year-old named Gaius Octavius, who Caesar had named as his primary heir in his will. This young man, later known to history as Octavian and eventually as Augustus, proved to possess a political shrewdness that stunned nearly everyone who initially underestimated him because of his youth. After a period of tense rivalry, Antony, Octavian, and a third general named Marcus Aemilius Lepidus formed what historians call the Second Triumvirate, an alliance formally recognized by Roman law, unlike Caesar's earlier informal arrangement, granting the three men essentially unchecked power to reorganize the state and hunt down Caesar's assassins. The Second Triumvirate's rule began with a campaign of political purges known as the proscriptions, in which the names of political enemies were publicly posted, stripping them of legal protection and offering rewards to anyone who killed them. Thousands of wealthy Romans, including many senators, were executed and their property confiscated to fund the coming war against the conspirators. Among the most notable victims was Cicero, the great orator and statesman who had bitterly criticized Mark Antony in a series of public speeches after Caesar's death. Antony had Cicero specifically targeted, and after his execution, his severed hands and head were displayed in the Roman Forum, a grim symbol of the brutal new political reality that Caesar's murder had ultimately produced, a reality far more violent and far less restrained than anything the conspirators had claimed to be fighting against. Brutus and Cassius, meanwhile, had fled to the eastern provinces, raising armies and gathering resources in an attempt to defend the republic they claimed to have saved. In 42 BC, the forces of the Second Triumvirate met the armies of Brutus and Cassius that the conspirators had claimed to be fighting against. Brutus and Cassius, meanwhile, had fled to the eastern provinces, raising armies and gathering resources in an attempt to defend the republic they claimed to have saved. In 42 BC, the forces of the Second Triumvirate met the armies of Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi in Greece, one of the largest battles of the ancient world. The fighting unfolded across two separate engagements. In the first, Cassius's forces were pushed back, and receiving inaccurate reports that suggested Brutus's forces had also been defeated and that all was lost, Cassius took his own life, unaware that Brutus had actually succeeded on his side of the battlefield. Weeks later, in the second engagement, Brutus's forces were decisively defeated. Rather than face capture, Marcus Brutus also took his own life, reportedly running onto his own sword with the help of a loyal companion. With their deaths, the last major leaders of the conspiracy against Caesar were gone, having failed entirely to achieve the restoration of the republic they had killed for. End of the conspirators. With the conspirators defeated, the uneasy alliance between Antony and Octavian inevitably began to fracture as each man sought ultimate control over the Roman world. Antony aligned himself politically and romantically with Cleopatra of Egypt, while Octavian consolidated power in Rome and portrayed Antony to the Roman public as a man who had abandoned Roman values for Eastern excess. Their rivalry culminated in the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, a decisive naval engagement in which Octavian's forces crushed those of Antony and Cleopatra. Both Antony and Cleopatra took their own lives rather than face capture, leaving Octavian as the undisputed master of the entire Roman world. The Republic, already a hollow shell in practice since Caesar's dictatorship, was formally reorganized under Octavian, who took the name Augustus and became, in all but name, the first Roman emperor, ruling with powers that Caesar himself had never fully claimed. The very outcome the conspirators had killed to prevent permanent one-man rule over Rome arrived, anyway, only a generation earlier than it might otherwise have, and without any of the political rights the old republic had once guaranteed. The consequences of that single afternoon in the Senate rippled outward across the following centuries in ways the conspirators could never have imagined. The Roman Republic, a system of government that had endured for nearly 500 years, effectively ended, replaced by an imperial system that would govern the Mediterranean world for another 5 centuries in the West, and continue in the East for well over 1,000 years beyond that. Caesar's own reforms endured in remarkable ways. The calendar he introduced, later refined slightly under Pope Gregory centuries afterward, remains the basis for the calendar most of the world uses today. His military reforms and organizational innovations influenced generations of future commanders. The very phrase Caesar became a title of supreme authority, echoed centuries. Later in the German word Kaiser and the Russian word Tsar, both directly descended from his name. His life and death became one of the most retold stories in Western literature, immortalized centuries later in dramatic form that cemented certain lines, whether historically accurate or not, permanently into popular memory. The phrase, the Ides of March itself, transformed from a simple date on the Roman calendar into a universal shorthand for betrayal and impending doom. Historians continue to debate certain details surrounding the assassination. It remains uncertain exactly what Caesar's final words truly were, if he spoke any at all, as ancient sources themselves disagree. The precise depth of Marcus Brutus's personal relationship with Caesar, including the persistent rumor that Brutus may have been his biological son, has never been conclusively proven or disproven. What is far less debated, however, is the outcome. The conspirators believed that by killing one man, they could restore an entire system of government to its former ideals. Instead, they triggered nearly 15 years of additional civil war, mass executions, and political chaos, ultimately delivering exactly the kind of permanent, unchecked rule they claimed to be preventing, concentrated now in the hands of Caesar's heir rather than Caesar himself. This leaves history with a question that remains genuinely unresolved. Was the Roman Republic already doomed by 44 BC, a system too corrupted by inequality, ambition, and the loyalty of armies to individual generals to survive, regardless of what happened to any single man? Or did the conspirators, through their own violent action, actively destroy whatever chance the Republic still had, removing the one man who, whatever his ambitions, had at least succeeded in ending the earlier round of civil wars and stabilizing the state? Historians continue to argue both sides, and the truth likely lies somewhere between the two. A republic already critically wounded by decades of internal decay, finished off decisively by an act of violence intended to save it. Julius Caesar survived countless battles. He defeated entire kingdoms. He crossed impossible rivers. He conquered Gaul. He defeated Pompey. He escaped pirates who held him captive at sea. Yet, in the end, the greatest threat to Rome's most powerful man was never a foreign army, and it was never a rival general on some distant battlefield. It was the men standing beside him inside the Senate, men he had pardoned, promoted, and trusted with his own life. More than 2,000 years later, the Ides of March remains one of history's greatest lessons, a warning passed down through every generation that has studied it since. Sometimes, the most dangerous enemies are the ones who call themselves your friends,